All right, let's select the stream. Okay, let's double check and make sure it sounds like it's working. Let's see. How do we sound? Looks like we sound pretty good. That's cool. All right. Let's just make sure we can share this on YouTube and then we will get going. Okay. Okay. Almost there. Copy the link. I'm going to get rid of you. I'm just going to share it real quick. Okay. Alrighty, folks. It's gonna be fun, maybe, potentially. So we'll see. All right. Well, welcome, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of UnShrink Me. Happy Saturday, everybody. My name is Dr. Patrick Lockwood. For the purpose of this podcast, so you don't sue me, I'm just Patrick. So welcome to UnShrink Me. And if you are brand new to the UnShrink Me universe, just know that this is a weekly podcast dedicated to mental health and specifically dedicated to the consumers of mental health services. So I am here on behalf of the patients, the people who are actively seeking out mental health services. And the reason I do this podcast every week, just so everybody knows, is I want to make sure that the people actually receiving psychotherapy, counseling, coaching, case management, family therapy, couples therapy, psychiatry, whatever, I want to make sure you all have the best chance possible of getting the best possible care out of your professionals. So this podcast is dedicated to the consumers. Oftentimes, I will be lucky enough to have some of my friends here. And it looks like my buddy Jonathan Cogburn is here. Good to see you, John. Thanks for joining me from the garage gym. I love to see you here, man. Thank you so much for being here. So this is a weekly podcast dedicated to mental health, specifically dedicated to the people who are trying to get services. And so I am not acting on behalf of any of you individually. I am not your therapist, your consultant, your coach, or your counselor. I am just another guy rambling on a microphone on the internet. That's all I am. So don't sue me. I'm not giving you mental health advice. I just try to provide reasonable critiques and discuss ideas reasonably in a general way so that if anyone does seek out mental health services or is seeking out mental health services, they can get more out of those services. That's the whole spirit of this. Sometimes I say critical stuff. Sometimes I say funny stuff. Who knows? We'll see how it goes today. Today's episode is going to be a little spicy, so strap in. And as always, the podcast is not NOT sponsored by Celsius, but I do love this stuff. It is awesome, and it makes everything better, in my opinion. So, welcome, everybody. So glad you're here. And today we have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about denial and not just the river. We're going to talk about education and mental health. We're going to talk about a few other spicy things, and who knows? We'll see how it goes. But first, I always like to start with kind of a softball, easier to digest post. And so for those of you who don't know, if you're brand new to the podcast, what I like to do is find interesting content from Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it. And I then use that as prompts for today's podcast. So here's what we're going to do. And if you are brand new to the podcast, my handle on Twitter, so you can follow along for the things I'm retweeting, is at Alobha Patrick. ALOBHAPATRICK. That is my handle. All right, so let's start with the softball idea. So we're going to retweet it right now. And so this is from someone that I don't regularly interact with on Twitter, but I think it's a worthwhile thing to discuss. Okay, here we go. Okie dokie. So, approximately on February 10th, a person named Brighton Psych at BRIGHTONPSYCH. He put out a thread on February 10th that said, "When diagnosis becomes destiny." And here's just the first of the many posts in his thread. He said, and I quote, "When diagnosis becomes destiny, we have collectively turned diagnosis into a modern identity card. Useful at times, but dangerous when it hardens into who you are. In psychoanalytic work, we loosen the grip of the label so the person can return to living, feeling, choosing." Excuse me. So let's talk about this because there's so many things he said in his thread, and I do encourage you to actually read the thread. So I'm not trying to intentionally cut short all the things that he's saying, just for the sake of this podcast so we can get to other topics. Please read the thread. It's interesting. But I want to talk about the general point because I think a lot of people who are seeking out therapy or counseling or couples therapy or rehab or whatever, they're often very conflicted about this concept we call diagnosis. So for many people, receiving a diagnosis from a doctor, a therapist, or something like that is relieving because the diagnosis helps them kind of make sense of very complicated things in a very simple way. So it's a shorthand, it's a heuristic, it's a stereotype, if you will. And this makes things easier for some people because for some people, their diagnosis summarizes very neatly what they think their suffering is all about, right? And I'm sympathetic to that case for diagnosis because for many people, their diagnosis nicely makes things make perfect sense in even a short period of time. You know, for a lot of people with PTSD or a serious substance use disorder, once they actually understand how it works, everything makes sense. Now, for a lot of people, diagnosis becomes destiny, as he said in his original post. And here's why that's a serious problem. And what I originally said in response to his post is diagnosis should not be destiny for most people. And here's why. Most diagnoses resolve on their own. We have epidemiological data that says very clearly that most people with a mild to moderate condition will resolve or lessen without any clinical professional support. And so that tells you that, one of two things is true. Either these diagnoses aren't super legit, which is valid, or that most things are more manageable than people think, right? So the good news is a lot of people that get diagnosed with something or could technically be diagnosed with something don't actually need any help, which is awesome. Mild cases of generalized anxiety disorder, mild substance use disorders, all resolve on their own and are manageable without a professional. Thank goodness. So if you are mildly suffering, maybe you don't actually need any professional help. That's a possibility. I don't know, but it's a possibility. So what I would say is that your diagnosis should almost never be your destiny. I think there are only very few exceptions where people see their diagnosis as something permanent that is valuable to integrate into their identity. Probably one of the important exceptions is something like psychotic disorders. Another important exception is something like bipolar, especially the severe kind. And then a third exception would be serious personality disorders, So if you are genuinely, actually, legitimately built differently, which is true for some disorders, that is a part of your destiny. However, for the vast majority of other mental health conditions, these are not your destiny because they can be managed and minimized to the point that you don't have to do a heck of a lot of maintenance work to be symptom-free for the rest of your life, which is awesome, So what I would hope for everyone, just in summary, is that your diagnosis is almost never your destiny, except for those few exceptions I listed there. And what I really hope for everyone, even with those exceptions, is that your identity, whatever it is much more complicated and nuanced than just a label some psychiatrist or psychologist gave you. Because you are more complicated than all that. So your diagnosis is almost never destiny because there are many paths to healing. There are many paths to, seeing how you can function in the world. And almost none of it requires some permanent relationship with a diagnosis. So that's my little rant about that. Darren McGee is here. Thanks for chatting. He says, I'd say it really depends upon a variety of factors. but a diagnosis doesn't have to be for life. Exactly. That's exactly what I was saying. I gave 3 exceptions, which are serious severe bipolar disorder, serious severe psychotic issues, and personality disorders. But notwithstanding those 3 exceptions, the rest of these so-called diagnoses can be more mild or moderate and managed or even to some degree eliminated in terms of like needing some ongoing work. So notwithstanding that, I think we're on the same page, Darren. Next up, let's talk about my buddy Nick Tabor, as always. So I'm going to retweet this right now. And I think it's important because I think a lot of people don't really understand what therapy is and what a good therapist is. And so this is part of my duty to help the public not get hurt by the profession. So thank you, as always, to Nick for providing the grist for the therapy mill, for the podcast mill. Okie dokie. So as always, Nick says provocative things that I think are worth discussing in a more open and nuanced way. So 5 days ago, on Twitter, Nick Tabor, at NICKTABER, he said the following. He said, and I quote, "All the talk about psychotherapy being collaborative and iterative masks the fact that there's tons of mental health professionals out there thinking they have special insight to people's psychology due to their training that they don't really have." So I chuckle a little bit because he's naming a couple of important dynamic problems. And I'll speak to those in just a second. But let me tell you what I said. So here's what I responded that same day. I said ethical providers see their work as collaborative and iterative. Gurus have special insight. There are too many gurus and not enough therapists. So this is my way to tongue-in-cheek kind of agree with Nick because I think he is correct. Excuse me. So let me just kind of walk out a couple of things. So the first chunk of what he said was, there are a lot of people online, myself included, and many of my colleagues and friends here in the chat, who talk about being ethical, who talk about doing therapy the correct way, who talk about having professional boundaries, and we talk about being collaborative. We talk about being iterative, and we're very clear that we're trying to do the right thing. We're trying. That doesn't mean we perfectly do it, but we're at least interested in having the correct kind of boundaries with people, right? Which is more than some people can say. And so what Nick said is all of us who are talking about it are masking the fact that there are tons of people who are basically pretending to be ethical while still believing they're so special and so smart and so insightful that they perfectly understand or understand the patient in such a deep and profound way that they know exactly what the person needs and should be doing and thinking and all these things, right? So I definitely am sympathetic to Nick's perspective because those people are gurus. And there are so many people who are intelligent, who have lots of training in different types of like psychodynamic theories and things like that, and deep therapy. I always find it interesting when people talk about depth psychology because I think there's a fine line between having a lot of cool ideas and concepts in your brain as a professional to help you understand people better versus having special insight that gives you permission to perfectly know what people need and should do, right? So I think there's a line, Nick, just to be clear. I think a lot of us, myself included, have some really cool training, right? Like I have some interesting training and knowledge of like psychoanalytic self-psychology. And as a subdiscipline of psychodynamic therapy, it teaches you some very interesting ways to look at transference, to look at narcissism and exhibitionism and the integration of, ego and things like that into the self-concept. And so these are super fascinating things for me, and they've helped me see people differently. Now, the fact that these new concepts, or these newer, I guess you could say, concepts, have allowed me to see people differently and maybe even see some depth, if you were to use that word, does not mean that my special insight, so-called, actually gives me permission to believe I know exactly what's happening in somebody's mind. So there's a difference in my mind, and all of you in the chat here who are watching and listening, I hope that you chime in. But like, I think there's a world of difference between having some cool concepts that are more complicated and potentially can help you find depth in a person versus having these cool concepts and believing you're correct and believing that your special insight gives you special permission. So that, I think, is the dividing line, dear Nick. I think ethical providers of every intelligence level and every insight level can completely walk right on that line and have to walk on that line between seeing things and understanding things versus giving themselves permission to be a guru, right? Because gurus tell you what to do. Gurus use their profound insight to give you specific direction about how to handle your life. And I think ethical providers are not trying to tell people what to do necessarily. I think ethical providers are trying to be collaborative, as I said in my post, and iterative, which means that we're trying to iterate. We're trying to do things over and over again and create small improvements by having a discussion where both parties weigh in and offer ideas and insights and collaboratively create a plan together to see if these insights and ideas actually can correlate to meaningful change in their real life in between sessions. That's what we're trying to do if we're trying to do things ethically. That's what I try to do when I rarely am a clinician. As a supervisor, this is how I mentor my younger clinicians, is I'm trying to help people be collaborative and iterative. It's cool that you have insight. It's cool that you can spot a transference dynamic, or as a professional, spot your countertransference and how that's showing up and what that means about you and what you're reacting to in the patient. All that insight and knowledge is super great, but it doesn't get you anywhere if you can't have a collaborative relationship. You can certainly be coercive. You can be a guru. You can be a narcissist. You can be domineering. But that doesn't mean it's actually going to correlate to meaningful change that lasts, that a person feels emboldened to do something with. There's Willow back there who wants to get up and leave or reposition herself. So Nick, I think there are different camps of people online, Nick. I think some people online are in good faith. I think, like myself, I think I'm trying in good faith to tell you what I believe is ethical, and that whatever my specialness is kind of irrelevant to some degree, because the things that actually help, sometimes having a deeper understanding or more complicated understanding is really, really helpful. No doubt. And sharing that with the patient in a way that they can understand, that they agree with, is the art of psychotherapy. But that understanding alone doesn't mean they're going to act any differently. That doesn't mean it's actually even helpful, because insight without action is useless, number one. But number two, a lot of people believe that just being insightful will solve their problems because that will be what motivates them intrinsically. But the problem is, people are motivated by many things, right? So we have intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and it's very rare to see people who are just motivated by how they think and feel. Most people are both intrinsically and extrinsically motivated in a pretty balanced way. Darren says, I'd agree. Ethical therapists collaborate and see differences. Gurus think it's a one-size-fits-all answer. Absolutely, right? So if I understand that it's your trauma and all you got to do is breathe better, right? Like, yeah, breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, box breathing, whatever, is probably going to help you manage your emotional reactivity. But breathing is not going to solve your problem, because the problem, whatever it is, if it's trauma or whatever, is a little more complicated than just your emotional reactivity. That's like a piece of the problem. You know, it's about your childhood. Yep. Dad was mean, or dad was permissive, or dad was absent, or whatever, or mom was smothering, or mom was mean, or mom was absent, or whatever. All that insight could be super cool and super helpful. It could also be completely useless, because if you're not collaborating with the patient, those ideas don't resonate. They don't mean a thing to the person. And if you're a dictator, if you're a guru and a dictator are the same thing, by the way, then, you're going to tell people what to think, and you're going to tell people what to feel, and you're going to tell people what to do. And some people in the profession absolutely do that, Nick. So I think I count myself among the group of people, like I think many of the people in the chat here are, who believes that it's not our job to tell people what to think, what to feel, and what to do. It's our job to explore. I'm the guy with a map, but it's your journey. So what do you want to do with the map? Do you want to destroy the map? We can destroy the map and figure it out, Maybe we should get a different map. I don't know. Maybe we should use no map. I don't know. But I'm a guy who knows how to read maps. That's it. That's all I really am. I'm not super special. And that part of the profession, ChatGPT, Claude, whatever, all these things could do that. That part of the profession is not special. What's special about the profession, dear consumers of therapy, psychiatry, psychology, what's special about the profession is having a relationship that's ethical, collaborative, and human. That's what's special about the profession. It's not insight. It's not ideas. You could literally, anyone who wants to make a couple $1 million right now could take this idea and run with it. So if you wanted to make an AI chatbot that was just programmed based upon the principles of motivational interviewing, you could take that chatbot and release it and market it and get people to use it to lose weight, stop doing drugs, whatever it is, and it would make lots of money and it would work great, because AI chatbots that are built on principles that empirically work, like MI, for instance, it would solve a lot of health problems very quickly for, the 60% of people who don't need therapy, right? So they don't need the motivation of a real person. But there are some people who are struggling enough or sick enough, etc., who can only feel safe and motivated in safety by a relationship that's collaborative. That's a different group of people. But for most people looking to change their behavior, they don't need a therapist. If you want to lose a little weight, work out a little more, eat a little better, have a little more fun, laugh a little more, sleep a little better, a large language model built on the principles of like motivational interviewing would solve that for like 50 to 60% of the population. Like that. Probably in 3 to 6 months. But like, the hard part is the people who actually need a relationship to feel safe, to feel understood. Because the chatbot can help you feel understood to some degree, but the problem is the human element of it is what motivates us. It's that motivation extrinsically, by like feeling compelled to be in a relationship with people. And so that's what's special about the profession, in my opinion, which is not rocket science, but it's hard. Because being a real person and being an ethical person are very complicated. In many ways, being ethical and being real are hard to line up because feelings are hard to manage and navigate for people. So, dearest Nick, I hope you understand there are some of us who are not trying to make excuses for the gurus. I think the gurus need to be shouted out and talked about and dealt with very straightforwardly. So yeah. So curious if any of you have comments about that. Jonathan says, yeah, it's that time. We're back on it. All right, let's talk about another fun one. This is probably going to be a briefer one, but it's a fun one. So, I love Jonathan Shedler for so many reasons, and euphemistically at least, I don't think I'm in love with him. So let me just repost this real quick and then we will get going. Okay. So 4 days ago, Jonathan Shedler, who is a very, influential online therapist, consultant, etc., created a post 4 days ago, and his handle, if you don't know, is at JonathanShedler, Jonathan Shedler. He said this 4 days ago, and this is a quote: "More and more people are in individual talk therapy, learning a new vocabulary to apply to their lives," from The Atlantic. And Jonathan said, this is exactly what should not happen in psychotherapy. If a patient comes out of therapy with a slew of new vocabulary words or speaking in therapy speak, something has gone terribly wrong. Skilled therapists sound like people, not like therapists. People who get good therapy come out of it sounding more like themselves, not more like somebody else. So, thank you so much, Jonathan, because I agree with you. But let me just read what he said again. If a patient comes out of therapy with a slew of new vocabulary words or speaking in therapy speak, something has gone terribly wrong. Something is wrong. Okay? So, here's what I said. About a day later, I found his post and I said, relying on jargon is a sign of various therapist problems. Number 1, lack of training. Number 2, narcissism. Number 3, intellectualizing, in parentheses, as opposed to tolerating feelings. And number 4, countertransference issues. So as a clinical supervisor, I take very seriously making sure people get adequate training. And I want to make sure people avoid these very common pitfalls because it's very easy to rely on concepts. So if you're out there and you're currently receiving therapy or psychiatry or counseling or whatever it is, I want you to hear this loud and clear. It's understandable if your professional talks to you and tries to educate you and give you concepts so you can understand yourself. There's nothing wrong with some psychoeducation. But if people are emphasizing these concepts with you, then something is wrong, right? So I'm going to use an example I absolutely detest because I think it's just bullshit. So I'm going to talk about inner child. And I'm sure this is going to be completely non-controversial in any way, shape, or form. So I think there's a slew of therapists and counselors and coaches and gurus who talk ad nauseum about the concept of the inner child. And there are a lot of people, and you can always tell when someone's been to a guru therapist who's all about your inner child. Because the truth of the matter is, there's no such thing as an inner child. It doesn't exist. You can't locate it in the brain. There's no particular process, set of memories or whatever. And the EMDR people are equally guilty of this, by the way, where they talk about a younger you and a core memory we're getting to or some shit like that. And so the truth of the matter is none of that's scientifically valid, right? There's no real there when people use phrases like inner child. And so if you go to a therapist and they're talking about your so-called inner child or whatever it is, you're probably talking to someone who feels uncomfortable sitting with your feelings, number 1. That's the intellectualizing comment I made. And they probably think that their opinion of you is more important than your opinion of you. And they probably just don't understand how to sit with your experiences and help you take ownership of them. Right? So we can certainly act out in childish ways. That's true. People do that all the time. But that doesn't mean your quote unquote inner child is talking. Like you can be playful like a little kid, but that doesn't mean your inner child is being playful. That's fucking stupid. So what's really true is that you have these desires as a person of whatever age and developmental level to do things and feel things. Doesn't matter. And that's normal. And sitting with that and integrating things that you don't like, for instance, is part of the challenge, right? So if there's an immature piece of yourself, if there's a selfish piece of yourself, we can intellectualize away that piece of yourself by saying it's your inner child and excusing it and explaining it. But that's not actually dealing with the problem. That's giving you a label so you feel empowered to not actually take responsibility. And so just to expand on what Jonathan was saying in his original post, skilled therapists sound like people, not like therapists. So for instance, I'm a professor. I love what I do as a professor. I absolutely love being able to talk to the next generation of psychologists and MFTs that I get to teach and talk about these ideas. However, a lot of what I do when I talk to these people doesn't sound like being a professor Because what I'm trying to role model is being a regular person who happens to have knowledge of complicated and complex ideas with regard to psychology, therapy, and the brain. But I don't sound like a neuroscientist, ever. On this podcast, at college, sometimes I sound like a stand-up comedian. Sometimes I just kind of sound like myself. And that's the idea, is to sound more and more like myself and less like a quote-unquote professional, because I'm not a robot. There's not a stereotype that I need to embody in order for people to trust me, right? So skilled therapists, Jonathan said, sound like people, not like the stereotype of a therapist. And we want people to sound more and more like regular people, not to use jargon as a tool to pacify themselves, because that's what happens with a lot. Unskilled therapists feel very anxious and uncomfortable, and I have a couple of interns like this, where they just want to give people a concept so they can feel better about themselves. But that's actually to satisfy the therapist's anxiety, to calm their own worry about the ambiguity of therapy and the relationship, and will they be okay and can they tolerate it? That's about the therapist not being able to tolerate the distress and uncertainty of the therapy and what they're trying to do. So people give people concepts so that the concepts are more in charge and not the person. And that's not okay. And so everyone, I want you to understand this very clearly, unambiguously. If you come out of therapy talking more and more like a robot or a professor who teaches concepts, then you're not really getting therapy per se. You're getting coaching, which is totally fine if you need that. But you're not actually learning to sit with the experience they gave you a concept for. And the example I used here is the inner child. If you're being petty and stupid, like a little kid would be, it doesn't actually help you take more responsibility to say that's your inner child talking. It just gives you an excuse, and it allows you to not fully sit with the complexity of why you're being petty and stupid. That's not the same thing at all as being an adult who happens to have some immaturity or who feels vulnerable or whatever the reason is that you're being petty and stupid, right? So concepts are placeholders for adult responsibility. Now, some people are too vulnerable or fragile maybe to take responsibility, and I understand that, but that's about the therapist again being worried that they can't actually do their job effectively. So if you're out there and you're listening and you're watching and your therapist, your coach, your pastoral counselor, your couples therapist, whatever it is just like feeding you concepts, then they're just avoiding the relationship, number one. And number two, they're avoiding the feelings and struggles you're having. And they're trying to give you concepts and they're intellectualizing with you. And that is not good therapy. That's just the therapist being a coward usually. They're afraid of the relationship. They're afraid of having a closeness with you. And they're afraid of having boundaries with you. And they're afraid of being real with you and all these things. Maybe they don't think they can help you tolerate yourself. Maybe they can't tolerate you. Maybe they can't tolerate their own feelings. There's a lot of things that can be going wrong when your therapist is intellectualizing you and feeding you concepts. So you need to say something about it. And it's not the patient's responsibility, it's really the therapist's responsibility. But if you're in therapy with someone like that, feel free to speak up to them. You know what I mean? So I hope that makes sense. All right. Let's move on to denial. You know what? Nope. Let's put denial on the back burner. Let me talk about one of my favorite things I've seen recently. So Dr. Roger McFillin, I'm just going to repost this right now. Okay. So Dr. Roger McFillin, his handle is at DRMCFILLIN. This is what he said yesterday. So Dr. McFillin said the following: I am sure this is an unpopular opinion in American culture, and many will not understand this. I don't recommend people, quote unquote, focus on your mental health. I actually think this is horrible advice. Who knows what I'm talking about? And I said, it's terrible advice. So let me explain. So many of you listening and watching work in the profession. Some of you listening and watching are just patients or family members of patients. And so people who are trying to sell you on therapy, so therapists themselves, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, sometimes if you need to go to rehab, admissions people in rehab will say this kind of stuff to you. So let me cut through some of the car salesman tricks that professionals use to get you bought into treatment, okay? Because there's an ethical way to do this and there's a bullshit way to do this. So let me be extremely clear about this. Jonathan's like, put denial on the back burner. Denying denial? Are we? Meta-denial? Yeah. I'm not denying denial. I'm just delaying denial, Jonathan. Anyways, so I want to talk about this. People will often say, influencers in particular, influencers are the worst. I think it's influencers are the worst at this. And then I think people who are trying to sell you on going to rehab, admissions people, business development people in rehab are the worst at this. They're the worst people possible on the planet often. So some of them are great. I'm friends with them, but some of them are just terrible people. Bad car salesmen, all of them, most of them. So when people say to you, when professionals, when psychologists, when therapists, when admissions representatives, when counselors, when pastoral counselors, when anybody says the phrase, focus on your mental health, that is horrible advice. And the reason I think that's terrible advice is because of two reasons. Number one, it's terrible because you have no clue what your mental health is. Neither does that professional. Mental health is this nebulous thing that literally nobody can define. Nobody. Not the National Institute of Mental Health, not the World Health Organization, not clinical psychologists and psychiatrists. Ain't nobody knows what mental health is. None of us knows what mental health is. So it's a sales pitch. It's a big, emotionally compelling sales pitch, and that's crap. So that's the first reason you should always run screaming from people who say focus on your mental health. The second reason it's terrible advice is because your life is wildly complicated and you have many different needs. So if you're a family member of a patient right now, someone in rehab, someone in therapy, if you yourself are in therapy or rehab or couples therapy or whatever it is, I want you to hear this loud and clear. For the love of God, do not focus on your mental health. And the reason I think this is terrible advice is because your life is complicated. There are so many things that you should be focusing on, and there are philosophical ways to make everything about your mental health because everything relates to your mental health, which is just garbage philosophical nonsense. So let's be clear that there's so many things that you need to be doing that are good for you that have nothing to do with your mental health. So for instance, I'm going to name an example that's probably going to get me in some trouble, but you know what? I don't care anymore. Fire me, sue me, whatever. But like everybody on the planet needs to be having some kind of sex. Okay? And everybody should be getting off somehow. I don't know how much you should be getting off. I don't know with who. I don't really care. That's not my business. You do whatever you want to do. But the truth of the matter is, sex doesn't have some particularly strong correlation to mental health. If you have the right kind of sex with the right kind of person in the right kind of way and blah, 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 that's in alignment with your values, would you be mentally healthier? Sure. But is sex actually a piece of your mental health? No. But you should be having sex, right? Now, some activities we should be doing, like sleeping, eating good food, working out, etc., are more strongly correlated with your mental health. Joking around with your friends is really important. Is it going to cause you to have better mental health? Maybe. But that's assuming that this one variable lives in isolation. But the truth of being a real person is that everything we do is interrelated with everything else that we do. So it's not like I can tell you just go get laid and everything will be better. I'm sure there's plenty of people listening right now who should be having way more sex, and you'd be more regulated as a person. But that doesn't mean sex is going to improve your mental health. That's bullshit. So let me be clear that there's so many things we can be doing that are good for us, whether or not they improve our mental health. Because I would say, just to name an absurd example, probably the vast majority of people with obsessive compulsive disorder are not going to magically get better just because they go get laid more. I doubt it. I really genuinely doubt it. We could run the randomized controlled clinical trial, and boy, what a fascinating randomized controlled clinical trial that would be, right? I can't even say because it's absurd. But like, imagine we do this experiment where it's like 50 people with OCD are assigned to go get laid more, and 50 people with OCD are assigned to ERP, evidence-based treatment for OCD. I sincerely doubt that the randomized controlled trial with the sex the piece of it would go better. I could be wrong. I don't know, but I sincerely doubt it. So here's what I'm saying is focusing on your mental health is a terrible idea because there's so many things that we could and should be focusing on, and it's impossible to know, in my opinion, as a professor, as a consultant, as a family therapist, blah, 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 credential, it's impossible to know which variables will really truly affect your mental health because there's a lot of chance, there's a lot of luck in people's lives. So my encouragement to everyone is not to focus on your mental health. It's terrible advice. Do not focus on your mental health. I mean, as far as advice goes, focus on your mental health is terrible advice because basically it's a sales pitch for therapy, coaching, counseling, whatever it is. Now, to be fair, just to steel man the argument, so I don't get called out for nonsense, I'm sure there are plenty of people who badly neglect their emotions and their psychological needs. I have no doubt that those people exist. And so should they be putting more energy and effort towards whatever you want to call taking care of your emotions and your interpersonal needs? Absolutely. But there are people who just could be going to the gym for vanity purposes, and that will have an indirect consequence to their mental health that's positive. So I don't really care about mental health. Let me say this again as clearly as possible. Excuse me, Willow. I don't care about your mental health. Me, Patrick Lockwood, the clinical psychologist, professor, consultant, family therapist, whatever, I do not care about your mental health. I care that you do the things that are meaningful and valuable to you, and that's it. I don't care about your mental health because I don't know what mental health is. I've been a professor for almost 9 years, I think, at this point, and I still have not figured out what mental health is. I've been a clinical supervisor for 5 years. None of my supervisees have figured out what mental health is. So if somebody can help me figure it out, maybe I'll start encouraging it. But at this point, I have no freaking clue. Here's what Drew says. Drew says, finding what makes you happy takes a lot of the trial and effort. He said it's a lot harder to sell than a cheap fix. Yeah. I mean, the cheap fix is come do therapy with me and your life will get better. That's what coaches do. That's what gurus do. Ethical therapists are like, well, we can explore this problem and we can try these experiments, and these experiments may help you with this problem you've defined. But what it will do for your life, I don't know, because I'm not here to manage your life. Ethical therapists are not here to fix your life. Ethical therapists are here to talk about a specific psychological problem that you believe you have, Just to say it one more time in case people didn't hear me correctly, ethical therapists are here to deal with and address a specific problem that you think you have. That's it. We are not here to fix your life. I am not here to fix your life. I don't have the magical superpowers. You know, if I had billions of dollars, then I could probably coerce you with money and things like that to do things that are better for your life. But I can't actually fix anyone's life as a professional. It's not ethical to do that. That's not what I'm here to sell. So the advice, which is focus on your mental health, is terrible for most people, in my opinion. In Patrick Lockwood, not the professor, not the psychologist opinion. I have no clue what mental health is, and I probably will never, is my guess. Probably. So I hope that makes sense to everyone. I encourage you to not focus on your mental health. I encourage you to focus on whatever is meaningful and important to you. And I don't know what that is. I can't know what that is because I don't live in your body. I don't live your life. I don't have your relationships. I don't have your finances. I don't have your health. I have no clue what you need. I can't know. It's impossible for me to know. I'm not a guru, you know? So, there you go. Okay, let's talk about denial. It's finally time. I have delayed denial for so long. So here we go. Let's talk about denial. Here we go. Okie dokie. So Angie, I don't know if you're listening, but if you are, I hope you chime in because I'd love to hear what you have to say. My buddy Jake is here. He says, hyperfixating on mental health has wrecked too many people, including therapists. The better focus is do the things that make life work. Absolutely. Excuse me. I completely agree. Do what makes life work. Why would you focus on your mind? What a terrible thing to focus on. So my buddy Jake here agrees with me. Glad you're here, Jake. So, Angie, I hope you're here too, because I'm about to talk about you. Not behind your back, but publicly. Hopefully with your... Oh my God. Oh, the other Jake is here. Oh my God. Do I have two Jakes or just one? Anyways, I'm glad you're here, Jake. Okay, so here we go. Angie. And I think I'm not going to get her handle correct, so let me look at it real quick. So her name is Angie Peacock, and her handle is at ANGPEACOCK 1111, 4 ones. So here's what Angie said. So Angie is one of the like deprescribing therapy harm people on Twitter. And I don't mean to say that dismissively or anything. I'm just trying to summarize quickly. I hope that you follow her because she says interesting and useful things. So again, that's just my quick summary for those of you who don't know who she is. So here's what she was having a hard time with something Chris Palmer, the kind of quasi-famous psychiatrist, said about people being in denial about needing help. Here's what she said. Chris Palmer said, let me rewind. Here's what Chris Palmer originally said. He said, in quotes, "I'm not sick. I don't need help." And I said, don't worry about it. Chris is a good guy. Don't worry about what he's trying to say, because she said he's trying to gaslight people. Here's what I said. It's really complicated. Denial is an ordinary defense that we all have. And it shows up in illnesses and illness-maintaining ways for people who are ill often. Some people have been inaccurately labeled as mentally ill, when in reality their circumstances are abhorrent, difficult, and terrible. And so we have a real problem as professionals. And let me speak to this as thoughtfully as I can. But before I speak to the problem we have as professionals, let me get to Jake's comment. He says, in fact, my 16-year-old just got on serious antibiotics. They will wreck his gut biome. I told him to be aware that his depressions are about to become deep and anxiety's high. Therefore, so take this lesson for what it is. Emotions and feelings are often BS. 100% they are. 100%. Emotions are often fictions that are designed to promote us or be intrinsic motivations for us, So, we shouldn't really give our feelings and our thoughts much credit, in my opinion, but that's just me. So to get back to the point that Angie was making. So Chris Palmer puts out this post about people being in denial and needing help. And Angie had a strong reaction to it. It's like gaslighting and things like that. So let me say this very clearly. There's a segment of the population who has inaccurately been labeled as mentally ill when in reality they just live in horrific circumstances. Right? So if you live in a home where people are actively abusing you all the time, and you yourself are irritable and angry all the time, and you're defiant in school as a kid, they might label you with ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, as an example. When in reality, you just have a shitty home life. And in reality, your ODD is just a cry for help and not a disorder, right? But a lot of these kids in schools have terrible home lives or stupid parents or missing parents or whatever it is. And because of that, they look anxious and depressed and traumatized and neurodivergent and whatever else, but they just have shitty parents. And so shitty parents is not a disorder. Shitty teachers is not a disorder. Shitty family is not a disorder. Shitty culture is not a disorder. And so it's really important for everyone to hear. There are many kids in particular who are diagnosed with things that don't actually have a diagnosis. They are inaccurately diagnosed, and then they are put into the mental health system, which they should not be put into. Now, in some cases, when they are inaccurately put in the mental health system as kids, it allows the system to intervene on their shitty system. So that's a good thing. But in many cases, it just pathologizes the kid more and more and more, and the kid gets sicker and sicker and sicker because now they're being taught that they're the problem, and they're sick and broken and stupid. When in reality, the kid is not sick and broken and stupid. So some kids, especially, are told that they're ill when they're not. Some adults are told that they're ill when they're not. Now, that being said, there are many people who are in denial of their illness. This is especially the case with personality disorders and bipolar disorder, in my experience at least. So different types of personality disorders like narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, etc. These kinds of conditions often come with a lot of denial because these personality traits are egocentric, right? So grandiosity and narcissism is something that makes sense to that person. It's the way that they see the world. They live through like grandiose lenses. They can't see the world any differently. And by the way, in true narcissism, like the true disordered version, that doesn't magically go away. You know, that doesn't change a whole lot, even with the best intervention. It just becomes tempered. So the truth of the matter is, some people are very in denial about how ill they actually are. Especially political types online, especially activists online, especially coaches and gurus and therapists online. Many people in the public eye are very unwell people. You know, like, I'm going to say something quasi-controversial, but no, I have respect for this person. So I think Jordan Peterson is a great example of this. And I'm not trying to shit talk Jordan Peterson, just so we're clear. I very much respect and appreciate and like Jordan Peterson, which is probably going to get me canceled for so many reasons, and fuck it. But here's the deal. He did a lot in the early part of his public career to talk about basic behaviorism, 12 rules for life, and all this stuff that's generally useful advice for a lot of people. Stand up straight, and so on and so forth. And all that stuff is generally useful. And God bless him for taking on some of the fights that he did. I appreciate him for some of the very good things that he did because he did some very good things. He had some really cool interviews on his podcast with experts of different kinds. So I really do appreciate and respect Jordan Peterson for many reasons. Now, dear DBT people, let's keep two conflicting opinions in mind at the same time. One thing that I think is abundantly true about our buddy Jordan, who I hope is okay, because I know he's been through some health shit. I think Jordan was very in denial about many of the ways in which he is not well psychologically as a person, right? So I think he is a fairly aware person, but I think there's some pieces of his personality that he's not super aware of and was very definite about, and that is why he keeps getting sick physically, in my opinion. I know he has other health issues, but I think part of his problem is his personality. And it's not to say that he's a bad person. I'm not all or nothing. It's not an all or nothing thing. I think it's complicated. So I respect him for many reasons. I also think he is in denial about some of his narcissism and things like that. And that's true for many people who become famous. He is genuinely smart. He is genuinely special. I think he's also kind of narcissistic. And that's part of what keeps him sick. And unfortunately, the world rewards people who are built like Jordan. And I'm not saying I'm mad about it. I think he's done a lot of good in some ways. So for me, what I would say is that denial for people who are ill is self-destructive. And so, dear Angie, I hope you understand that there are so many people online, in particular, especially on Twitter, who think they're morally just and righteous, who are actually just sick. They're vomiting their trauma on people. This comes down to politics and anti-psychiatry and pro-psychiatry and all these things. So many people are just so unwell. And they're in denial about how unwell they are, and they have justified how unwell they are. This is especially dangerous and life-threatening for people with psychotic disorders, bipolar disorders, and severe substance use disorders. So I'm very worried about denial for the sickest of the sick, because it can kill people. It can promote suicide. It can promote unintentional self-harm by overdosing on drugs and thinking you can get high one more time, and all these kinds of things. So denial is actually very dangerous in a subset of people who are at most risk for unintentional death and intentional death. But is it life-threatening for people who are like a little sick or not super sick? Not really, I would say. And I definitely agree that some people were gaslit or should not have been diagnosed. So Angie, I hope you understand what I say when I say denial is very dangerous for a subset of the population who is very sick and don't want to see how sick they are. So I hope that makes sense to everyone. Now it's complicated. I named some examples like serious bipolar or severe substance use we call addiction or whatever, but like it's complicated. And people are complicated, so let's not kid ourselves. So Jake said, but not experts. Experts are always clean and pure. Yeah, I'm an expert. I'm totally healthy and sane. I'm great, right? Everything about me is totally fine. But other people, no, they're sick. I'm fine. Dr. Lockwood, I'm awesome. I'm amazing. I'm great. But those other people, those gurus online, those are the sick people. I'm pure. I'm not sick because I talk about how the sick other people are. So I must be okay, right? So yeah, that's just, I want everyone to understand that, it's complicated, but denial is a problem. It's a serious problem for a lot of people. And I want you to understand that, if we don't focus on the very, very ill types who are more at risk of harm, then we're going to miss life-saving opportunities. So that's my only concern. So yeah, we've talked about a lot of interesting stuff today. We've talked about denial, and we've talked about focusing on your mental health, all these fun things. Jake says, I have a client who's a psychopath. One of the things we discuss is why he is like that and where he fits. Yeah, because he fits in the world, but he's got to fit in a very limited box in the world. Jonathan said, I'm over here trying to make what? What are you trying to make, Jonathan? What are you doing? I have some very interesting comments. Jonathan says, I'm over here trying to make a compound word out of trauma and vomiting. Traumating? Vomita? Sounds very Latin. Yeah. When people vomit their trauma online, I'm just kind of like, that's not good. That's really not good. That's not a good sign. You're probably not well. I'm sure you've been hurt for real, and that's why you're reacting the way you are. Boy, is that not good. That's not a good sign. If you're vomiting your trauma online, you need help, in my opinion. Career Flex says fluid trauma. It's not. We need to find something catchier. Trauma fluid? Oh, gross. I love that. Trauma fluid. Ugh, yuck. Okay. Well, what a fun note to end on. Trauma fluid. I think we're going to tweet about that as soon as this podcast is over. So, Thank you all, I guess, for coming and chatting. We've certainly wrapped up in a very interesting way here today. It's been a really interesting podcast, and I really appreciate you all being here because, notwithstanding traumating, yeah, I like traumating too. Notwithstanding trauma fluid and traumating, I believe that we have at least maybe offered some perspectives that people don't normally get. So thank you for helping me accomplish this mission today. Everyone who showed up, like Drew and Jake and Jonathan, and you're all, and Darren. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you for supporting me and adding to the conversation and making things just more fun and easier. You know what I mean? And if this was helpful in some way, if I provided a perspective you think you needed or someone else would need, please like and share and subscribe and all these things and get the word out. I'd like to build an audience so that we can help more people have a better chance at getting what they need from their mental health professionals and not being hurt or taken advantage of by them. So thank you so much for being here with me today and adding to the discussion. And as always, I like to end the podcast with a joke. So without further delay, here we go. So I once had this patient who had a pet parrot. And this is the first time I'd worked with someone who is like really like emotionally involved with his pet bird. And parrots are interesting creatures because they're kind of intelligent, but they're not that intelligent. They have the capacity to mimic speech, and that's cool. So anyways, his parrot was getting sick. He and I were working on anxiety, and interestingly enough, his parrot was getting sick, so it was worsening his anxiety, and he was kind of externalizing his anxiety on the parrot. He was focusing on the parrot. And so after a couple of weeks together, his parrot was getting more and more ill, and he noticed that his parrot stopped eating. And so he took the parrot to the vet, and the vet, gave the parrot, I think, some antibiotic or something. And still wasn't eating a couple of days later. And so he came back to therapy just terrified, like, is my parrot going to die? I love this bird, et cetera, et cetera. And, I'm not a vet, so I don't have any scope of practice to talk about it. But, like, what have you tried to feed your bird? And, he talked about bird seed and all these things. It's like, I've got a couple of cats. And like, not that one, but another one just loves Cheez-Its. My buddy Max, my cat Max, loves Cheez-Its, which are just terrible for you. They're not even food, but they taste great. And so I shared about my cat Max, because I share about my cats in therapy, because, boundaries. And he's like, maybe I'll try giving something salty or something to my bird. And so he went home. Apparently, he told me the next week that he went home and he gave his parrot a cracker, and it worked. He started eating again and started getting some weight again. It was more active, and I guess it was the salt that the parrot was looking for and missing. I don't know. I'm not a vet, so I don't know. Anyways, so he came back in. He's like, Dr. Lockwood, guess what? My bird's okay. It's been eating a bunch of different things, but I started with a saltine cracker. I was like, wow, that's awesome. It sounds like all Polly really needed was a cracker. All right. I hope you all have a great rest of your weekend. I hope you take good care of each other. But first and foremost, take good care of yourself. Eat good food. Have good fun. Laugh and joke around. And finally, have good sex. And I will see you next Saturday, same place,